So I'm Amelia Peterson, the program director for the LIS MBA at the London Interdisciplinary School, and I'm delighted to be here with Doyne Farmer and Simon Sharpe, two leading practitioners of complexity economics. Doyne is, amongst other things, a professor at INET, the Institute for New Economic Thinking at Oxford, and the author of Making Sense of Chaos. And Simon is the managing director of S-Curve Economics and author of Five Times Faster. I'm not going to do full introductions here because there are many great profiles of you both online and you know each other, and I want to let you both get right into this conversation. But just a scene set, so we're here together to talk about complexity economics or complexity approaches to questions that have perhaps been dominated by the methods or mental models of neoclassical economics. And so I want to start with a question of how you came to this, because neither of you started out in economics. Stone, you were a physicist. Simon, you were a diplomatic and policy advisor. So what got each of you first thinking about economics and then complexity economics? And Stone, perhaps you want to kick us off.
Sure. Well, it was a long and circuitous route. I I did a lot of things predicting stuff, time series, and that led me to start a quantitative trading fund. That led me to seriously start reading financial economics literature, which I thought was lacking the key ideas about how markets really work. And and when I got done with that, made enough money that I was happy what I needed, I just have since then been devoting myself to understanding to developing alternative ways to do economics.
Mm. And Simon, how about you?
Was through policy, working in the energy department, where economics is always a central consideration in decision making. And I was coming up more and more on things that didn't quite make sense to me in terms of the economics. And particularly when I started working on industrial strategy, and most economists inside and outside of government couldn't really explain why we should have one. Then I started reading a lot. We did a public consultation on industrial strategy, and that generated lots of interesting responses. And some of those led me into the academic literature. And I started finding out about different ways of understanding how the economy works. And it was really probably two things that more than anything shifted my thinking fundamentally. One was a paper by Brian Arthur, an old colleague of Doyne's, who wrote this paper called Complexity Economics, a Different Framework for Economic Thought. It's an incredibly good paper. And the other one was the book, also by one of Doyne's colleagues, Eric Beinhocker's book, The Origin of Wealth. I'd say those two things, after I read them, then I've never thought about the economy the same way again.
And and what for each of you is the kind of fundamental difference in a complexity understanding of the economy compared to a neoclassical understanding?
You first,
Simon, you
Dan.
want to go first?
Go for it.
Well, um, that's a good question, and I think people within the field might differ a bit on the answer. My answer would be that we don't necessarily or need to use utility maximization. In a standard economics, you construct a model by giving everybody a utility function and calculating the decisions everybody will make in order to perfectly maximize their utility. And in complexity economics, in contrast, we just try and figure out how a real person would make the decisions that need to be made through other means, like asking them or looking at how people have made decisions in the past, or even having something like a neural net that learns and tries to make a good decision. That doesn't mean it makes the perfect decision. Whereas in an economic theory, all the agents make the perfect decision every time. And that can make a huge difference. And there's other ways in which things differ. In complexity economics, we rely a lot on simulation. That's not the case in standard economics, where you write down equations that maximize the agent's utility and solve the equations. And more generally, we're able to incorporate behavioral factors into the decision making economic agents.
Hmm. Simon, would you agree or have anything else you want to highlight?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting answer, and I certainly wouldn't disagree. For me, if I have to say one thing as a fundamental difference, it's the idea of equilibrium. That neoclassical economics starts from assuming the economy is in a state of equilibrium, and there are various different ways of defining that, but it basically means a stable state, and then everything else is derived from that. And why does it assume all the agents that perfectly maximize everything they do in the way that Doyne was just saying? Well, it has to. If you're assuming an equilibrium economy, you have to assume all these other things to be consistent with that. And so this is why people have perfect foresight and of the future, which of course they don't in real life. Nobody thinks they do, but you need to assume that to keep it all self-consistent. And the difference is simply abandoning that assumption. Complexity economics doesn't assume equilibrium in the economy, doesn't say that that state could never arise, although once you start to think about it, you realize it's extremely unlikely on most scales of time and space. But as soon as you drop that assumption, then the way that you understand the economy changes fundamentally. It means it's got lots of different feedbacks and it's evolving, it's constantly changing, and cause and effect are likely to be disproportionate. And some things you do will be self-amplifying, some will be self-limiting. All of that, it becomes a very different kind of beast to deal with. I often say it's more like an ecosystem and less like a machine. The other thing that is quite fundamental, which Doyne was also alluding to, is the method of understanding the economy. The complexity method that Doyne, you were just describing is really one of a fairly pure application of the scientific method. It's descriptive. It's starting with no strong assumptions about exactly how the economy functions. It's looking at it, observing what it does, and then forming hypotheses based on those observations and testing them. Whereas the neoclassical approach, at least in terms of theory, is starting with some very strong theoretical assumptions, not really questioning those founding assumptions, and then deriving everything else from them. And that many economists will tell you in practice, it's very different. In practice, they'll describe their job as if it's basically data analysis. You get lots and lots of data and you analyze it and you see what you see. But if there is an economic theory, a guiding one for neoclassical economics, then it's very much based on these founding assumptions of equilibrium and everything that follows from that.
And so what's really the benefit of bringing in this emphasis on the more evolutionary perspective, on kind of dropping some of these assumptions about utility maximization or equilibria? You know, a traditional economist might say, okay, well, you know, of course we have to make assumptions, but we're doing it in order to be able to kind of reach these more comprehensive models of a system. They're always going to be abstractions. They're never going to be exact representations, but you know, they're the best that we've got. And if we enter into this world of kind of simulation, that, well, that's just a whole kind of another set of a different kind of assumption making that we don't want to do. What's the benefit of making that transition to the complexity view?
Well, you can make much more realistic models. The problem with utility maximization as a central thesis of the model is that as soon as you start putting in economic structure that's realistic, where you have nonlinear feedbacks, then you get equations that can't be solved. So you really have to keep your models very simple in order to solve them, and which ties your hands because you can't put in all of the realistic features that you need to put in to actually, that the real economy has. So mainstream economists are really stuck. They have to work very hard to build models that are too simple to be realistic.
Yeah, and another way of putting that is there's a difference between simplification and misrepresentation. People often mention the London Underground map as a good example of a simplification. And it is. It doesn't show the wiggly lines that all of the tube tracks have in real life. But it's not a misrepresentation. It shows you correctly that you can change from the northern line to the central line at a bank. It doesn't show that happening at, Elephant and Castle, where it doesn't work. So it's not misrepresenting it. And the problem if you start with wrong assumptions is you end up with misrepresentation and you just get the wrong answers. So it might feel easy to deal with, but there's no advantage having something that's easy to deal with if it's giving you the wrong answers. Yeah.
The challenge of bringing in this perspective, which requires then really taking account of things like feedback loops, of taking account of more dynamic effects, is the process of from say sort of analysis to decision making becomes much more blurred. It's a kind of constant then process of, okay, well, looking at what's happening in real time and trying to make decisions. What are you seeing as you're trying to bring those closer together for people? You're both in some ways, expert analysts, but you're now involved in different kinds of projects where people are really potentially trying to make decisions on the back of more real-time analysis. How is that going, or where are we at in the process of transitioning from sort of analysis and decision making as very separate stages to one where they could be more merged?
Well, I think economists would argue that they are merging analysis and decision making. Central banks run models and present the results all the time that have both analysis and recommendations about decision making. The people who actually make the decisions often don't make the decisions the models recommend. That's significantly because those models don't make correct predictions very often. Or let's say the predictions are not good enough to be very useful. So, but I think certainly we're also very interested in joining up analysis and decision making. And one of the main reasons I've started a company is so that we can get models that really run day in and day out. As it stands, we write a paper. My graduate student, gathers a lot of data, and then they go do something else when they graduate, and the model sits there when they're done. So we want to have the models that are literally running, collecting the data all the time. So if a policymaker calls us up and says, what's going on here? What do you think I should do? We can just tell them.
Simon, how kind of close are we to that sort of situation from your perspective, sitting in the policy world?
Yeah, I think your question is a good one, and it's making me think. There's always analysis that informs policy decisions, and sometimes it's better or worse. And a bit like Doyne was just saying, central bankers' models make policy recommendations and then they're not always acted on. Similarly, in the world of energy policy, any proposal to spend money on some kind of, say, clean technology deployment policy, it'll have a cost-benefit analysis that's done with it. Now, if people get used to the idea that those analyses don't really tell you very much about what's at stake in that policy decision, then it just means that they're being ignored. And that's not very helpful. People are putting time and effort into producing an analysis, and then it's really being ignored because it's just not getting at what you care about. The truth is, the things that you care about in policy, they often have some really significant uncertainties attached. And the challenge of analysis is working usefully with what information you do have, but also dealing constructively with uncertainty. And one of the things that I think is a real limitation or a failing of the standard approach is cost-benefit analysis when it's applied outside its appropriate domain, is it's really trying to predict outcomes at specific points in time, which are, static points in time in the future, when there's likely to be a large amount of uncertainty around them. And sometimes it's more useful, instead of thinking of outcomes at a point in time, to think about processes of change over the course of time and look at the feedbacks in the system that you're trying to do something with, figure out, are they reinforcing or balancing, and how are your actions likely to affect them? That can give you some better understanding of how you're engaging with this evolving system, which way you're steering it, and which actions are likely to be more effective than others. So you don't have to have a perfect foresight to be able to make a judgment about what's better and what's worse.
Just to continue on that topic of dealing with uncertainty, practically for people who are becoming interested in this area, who want to understand how can a complexity economics perspective, or how can the methods perhaps sort of help them find some of that middle ground between, what they recognize as total uncertainty and what they maybe recognize as models that are too inaccurate to predict anything of value to them. What can they be doing to try and move forward in this area? Is it just reading? Are there project examples they should be looking at? How can people move forward who are starting to get into this?
Well, standard economic models do have risk in them. I mean, that is, in a typical economics model, there is risk, meaning about the future. In other words, people don't necessarily know they don't have perfect foresight. There can be a range of possibilities, but the key is that they know what those possibilities are, and they know what the probabilities of those possibilities are. Whereas in the real world, often you don't know that. You have to make a decision in an uncertain environment where you may not even understand all the possible outcomes, and you typically really don't understand what the probability of the outcomes you do know are. And complexity economics can make use of behavioral rules that have evolved in order to be able to deal with fundamental uncertainty. And so that's a real virtue. It's also worth saying that in general, modelers should be humble about what they're doing and understand the limitations. And one of the things that we've worked hard to do in our models, and this is maybe not true of all complexity economics modelers at all, but is to really not just try and make a prediction, but make a prediction about how good our prediction is. And we work very hard to do that. Now, that said, there can always be some fundamental uncertainty that means your predictions about how good your predictions are wrong. But I would say in general that forecasts without error bars on the forecast are useless. If you have no idea how good the prediction is, why should you pay any attention to it? So this is it's just kind of a general problem in economics, complexity economics or otherwise. I'm not sure I answered the question you have in mind, though.
I think that definitely points to some directions of, one can start to think about what are some of the behavioral rules or patterns that can maybe help one understand how things sort of might progress, and get better at recognizing the difference between fundamental uncertainty and where there's always going to be some sort of limits on the predictions. And I think your point of really paying attention to how predictions that you've made in the past have been wrong, how wrong, and your attention to that and kind of updating that in an ongoing way is something people again can really learn from. Simon, how do you approach the question of sort of uncertainty versus risk or versus other aspects of prediction when you're trying to communicate with people about this kind of modeling or approach?
Well, yeah, maybe I can go back a step just because I think you were also asking people who are interested in this, how do they get into it? And it's a really good question. And I'm thinking the agent-based modeling, empirically grounded, high quality stuff that Doyne's talking about, that's the gold standard. That's where you'd love to be if you've got the resources or you've got the capability to do it yourself. That's what you'd want to inform a complex question. If you're not in that position, if you don't have the resources or the coding expertise or anything else you might need, how else do you get into this? But I'd say at the simplest level, there's a different set of concepts that you want to get your head around. And I'm someone who I'm typical in the sense that I've soaked up a lot of neoclassical economics theory without ever noticing it at the time. I read The Economist magazine for about 20 years. I listened to Radio 4. I hear all these people commenting on stuff. I read them in the Financial Times, and you soak up an enormous amount of received wisdom, principles for how the economy works, and ideas about it. And you need to unlearn a lot of that stuff, and you need to learn a new set of principles. So how do you go about doing that? Well, I mentioned the two, the paper by Brian Arthur and the book by Eric Beinhocker that had a big influence on my thinking. We can add Doyne's recent book to that recommended list. I think genuinely reading some of these things can change how you think about it. Then in terms of practicing something, the easiest thing that people can do is learn how to do causal loop diagrams, a simple form of systems thinking that just gets you thinking about feedbacks. That's a really basic method, but it's useful and it gets your brain working in a different kind of way. Something linked to that is the idea of system archetypes, patterns of feedbacks that often repeat themselves in the economy or in society, papers that have been published on that. We did a report on system archetypes in the energy transition. If you have a look at that, that's something that can help you spot the patterns. So I think those are some entry points. When it comes to the question of uncertainty, I think the key issue is not to fool yourself. That, as Dan was saying, you don't always know the probabilities of future events. And making up some probabilities and putting numbers on them doesn't mean you know them. It just means you're fooling yourself. So you have to be honest about the extent of uncertainty there is. And just because you don't know something and you can't predict it does not mean that it's not important. So if you only count the things that you know and add them up, then you've probably made a sum of things that are only partially relevant to what you're trying to decide.
Just to build on it, when you're trying to communicate, whether it's advice or outcome that's come from any kind of project, and there is some kind of fundamental uncertainty, how do you go about actually communicating that? Or the things where you say, actually, we had no data on this whole area, which we thought might have been relevant, but we just haven't been able to factor it into anything that we've been doing computationally or as a simulation. What's the sort of space for those kind of issues, and do you have any way of representing that in your work?
There are a couple of ways that are quite well established. One is risk assessment, where in certain parts of finance, risk means something you can quantify. In government, it usually doesn't mean that. In government, it means something bad that might happen, and very often you can't quantify that, like terrorism or war. And so there are well-established practices of doing risk assessment that embrace uncertainty. And in my mind, there's no reason not to do the same when you think about opportunities. You can think about them in terms of likelihood and magnitude. You don't have to be able to quantify those things to be able to say something sensible about them. The other practice that is quite well established is scenarios, where you start by asking what are the most uncertain things, and then that uncertainty becomes a resource. You play with it and you use it in a structured form of imagination to figure out what different futures could there be and how would your strategy fare in those different futures. And that, again, is a reasonably well-established concept. So it's not difficult to persuade people that that could be useful.
Yeah, and it's great to hear that how these are all approaches that we like to use as an interdisciplinary place and like to bring together. So it's good to hear the range. Doyne, I just want to go back to your book because it's now been a year or so since it was coming out, over a year. And what's the sort of reception been like? What kind of conversations have you been able to have off the back of that? Do you get a feeling that the appetite and understanding for complexity economics is growing?
Yes, I think the appetite is growing. It's particularly growing among, young people, among those who question the foundations of economics already. So that's, I think, been the main audience. But I have had quite a few young economists contacting me and expressing their frustration with the mainstream training they're getting. And I've had a few positive responses from mainstream economists, although mostly I would say they just ignored it.
Mm. Simon, from your perspective of talking to people on the policy side, is the appetite changing?
Well, yeah, I think so. Mostly, governments don't have a vested interest in a particular form of economic theory. Some economists do, of course. I don't mean to be rude about them, but we all have a vested interest in our careers and the things we've said in the past and whether or not any of that still stands up. Governments don't have that. They just want to get the right answer. They want to do a successful policy and they care about, are we getting good analysis? And in the field where I work, which is energy and climate change, you really do see a shift in understanding taking place. It's gradual. We really need to speed it up, but there is a shift in understanding. The thing I think best represents it is you look at how much more often people are talking about tipping points in the energy transition. In the past few weeks, the UN Secretary General launched a report which talked about tipping points in the transition. In fact, it cited a bit of work from Doyne's old team. The OECD has had a report on tipping points in the transition, which I was part of. The World Bank has written about it. The COP30 presidency team and the Brazilian government, they're talking about it. Now, why is all of this? First, a tipping point is not something that you have in an equilibrium system. It's very different from the old idea that decarbonisation is a game of marginal abatement, where it gets harder and harder. The more you try and reduce emissions, the more it costs. It's a completely different concept to imagine the transition has a tipping point, and after that, it gets easier and it accelerates under its own momentum. So that's a big shift in understanding. And the way I see it is tipping points are an entry point into complex systems thinking. It's easy, it's intuitive. Once you've grasped that, you can go on to think more about, well, what are the feedbacks that lead us up to a tipping point? How does the system look different after it? What else do we need to know about system instability and lock-in and path dependence and all that kind of stuff? So I think that's a sign of change. But of course, these deep underlying paradigms are actually very slow to change. And of course, it's not only economics that was built on concepts of equilibrium. That came from the natural sciences first, and complexity has spread through the natural sciences before eventually encroaching on economics. So these are quite fundamental levels of understanding, we can't be sure it will change quickly. That's why we have to make it hurry up.
What would you be looking at? Sorry, yeah, come on, Tom.
Well, maybe I could just add that I think economics is struggling now to reconcile the idea of behavioral economics, the ideas of behavioral economics, and the findings of behavioral economics with theory. And there's no good theory that puts the two together. There have been attempts, but they haven't been successful so far. And I think that's generating a lot of tension within economics because macroeconomists can see that the idea of rational expectations really fails when they try and apply it. And there are even essays within the field expressing this problem. And so economics is at a point where I think things are ready to change. And I think this has created an opportunity for complexity economics.
Mm-hmm. How do you see, I mean, this whole kind of field that is interesting, as you say, this is cut across many different disciplines. There have been multiple waves of complexity science approaches cutting across different disciplines, and this is perhaps the sort of latest one that has reached further into economics than ever before. And the organization of those has always been a bit of a struggle because anything that sort of crosses disciplinary boundaries can kind of struggle to find homes. There are obviously some major ones like Santa Fe, but are you seeing new kinds of institutions form? I mean, either from the experience of INET or from ESCA, of like who are you looking to as partners that are trying to field build in this new field?
Yeah, there's several new things forming. There's a complexity science hub in Vienna, for example, which has become I think it's 100 people or something like that there now. Um, there are several different complex systems institutes around the United States and several other groups in Europe that are doing it. One in Paris, Rome. Um, they even from in Göteborg in Sweden, that you can get a degree in complex systems, a PhD in complex system science. So it is spreading, although it's not taking over or anything, but it's definitely becoming more and more well established with time.
Yeah, and the I suppose from the point of view of trying to solve particular problems, then what you see is different kinds of expertise being quite dispersed. There are those kind of centers of academic learning about complex systems that Doyne mentions, and then there are fewer of those where people are using that kind of expertise and applying it to a particular problem. The Oxford INET is one example of that, where people are working on the energy transition and some other problems too. Another one that I expect many people in London will know is the Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose at UCL, Mariana Mazzucato's group. They don't necessarily talk about themselves in terms of complexity science, but they have that is at the basis of their understanding of how the economy works. And they're not focused on a particular issue, but they describe themselves as interdisciplinary and trying to bring people together to think about how you solve economic problems. But for me, I still see a big divide between the people with that kind of expertise in how the economy works and then the very applied expertise, understanding the sectors of the economy where we need to have low carbon transitions, how they really work, their industrial and financial structures, the political economy, and the market design problems. Those on the whole are very, very separate communities. And the reason we set up ESCO of Economics was really to try and bring the knowledge of those different communities more closely together.
So still lots of work to be done that, we hope people coming out of LIS can help further, whether it's in business or in civil society or in the public sector. I wanted to see if is there a final question you'd like to ask each other just before we have to close?
Sure, I've got one for you, Dan.
Okay, fire away.
So we've worked together a bit on the energy transition, and I think we very much share an understanding of how the complexity understanding of the economy is just fundamental there for getting the job done. Outside that field, where do you see the biggest potential for this new understanding of the economy to inform policy for the public good?
Well, I think virtually any branch of economics. I've been working on a model of understanding unemployment and vacancies and the dynamics of unemployment and vacancies. And I think we've made a lot of progress there and can overthrow some ideas about mainstream from the mainstream. I'm here at a workshop at Santa Fe where we have some avant-garde mainstream economists interacting with complexity economists, and I think we may be able to shed new light on what really causes inflation. And actually, that'll be an interaction between some mainstream models and complexity economics models. I think particularly understanding inequality, what are the drivers of inequality? How can we be prosperous and yet have much higher levels of inequality, or sort of equality in economic outcomes than those we have now? So those are a few of them. But really, I think you can take just about any branch of economics and redo things with a complexity economics perspective and arrive at insights that are closer to reality.
Wasn't it one of the really early agent-based models, the Sugarscape model was showing how a really simple, simple toy model of society tends to have this built-in dynamic that increases inequality over the course of time.
Mm.
Well, I think one of the things that comes out of models of inequality is that you see that unless we do something, inequality emerges. And
Yeah.
So we have to actually actively manage society in order to keep it from going out of control. At least that's probably been true since farming was introduced in the economy. Hunter-gatherers, maybe we didn't get such strong levels of inequality automatically, but as soon as you have any form of manufacturing or and 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 power. I mean, inequality happens when you let power go unchecked, and some people can tell other people what to do, but it also happens from just randomness. Some people get lucky, some people get unlucky. So many different sources of inequality are happening, and I think we just need to understand how to have a more just society by managing things properly.
That was actually the topic that first got me into being interested in complex systems perspectives. I was studying inequality and social policy and couldn't figure out why none of our methods could really make sense of it until I stumbled across a kind of feedback loop perspective. But I know that you both need to run off to other places, but I would love to have another conversation about that another time. But in the meantime, just thank you so much for your time today, and yeah, to be continued.